there, Cedar Rock. Welcome to the Bible Made Simple, Lesson 5. If you've made it this far, great job. I'm really enjoying this. I hope you are as well. Now, at this point, we've made it through a careful study of every step of the interpretive journey. We've got 3 steps, taking a lesson to cover each one, and now we're getting to the really fun part where we can just dive into Scripture itself. We're going to study a different genre every week from this point on. So we're beginning this week with the New Testament letters. And the reason that we're doing that is because the New Testament letters are generally easier to understand than some other genres. If you think about maybe Old Testament prophecy or some of the stories from the Old Testament, that'll start to be clear that the New Testament letters are a lot closer to where we find ourselves today as the church than maybe some of the stories about Israel in the Old Testament. So we'll get to those, we'll learn about how to handle those, but for this week, let's dive into a passage from a New Testament letter and talk about how to interpret it using these 3 steps that we've learned. So that's going to be the part here at the end of this lesson is a chance to interact with 2 verses from Romans 12. We'll learn how to walk through those together. So for now, I do just want to mention a few things that will hopefully help us when interpreting any passage from any New Testament letter. And so these are just a few quick facts about letter writing in the New Testament world. There are 3 things we need to know about letters. And the first is that letters in the New Testament world were authoritative. That is, when an apostle like Paul or James wrote a letter, that letter was meant to stand in for their own personal presence. So because they couldn't be physically present with the church that they were writing to, they decided to write a letter instead. But when the church received that letter and they read it out loud to their congregation, it was as if Paul or Peter or James were standing in the congregation giving the instructions that's in the letter. So letters were first authoritative. Second, letters were situational. And that means that I think without exception, every letter in the New Testament was written to address a situation in the life of the church. And so this involves also then that all of the letters in the New Testament, in our New Testament canon, were written to churches. There's one off the top of my head that I know of that was written to an individual. So that means that all the letters then were written to Christians, to people, to members of the Christian community. And so if there was a certain circumstance going on in the community, maybe a disagreement like we have in the letter of Philippians, for example, maybe instruction that a younger person in the faith needed, and I'm thinking of 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus. So every letter then was an occasion for the author to write, to address that issue going on in the church. So letters were authoritative, letters were situational, and lastly, letters were meaningful. And this is almost redundant. We shouldn't have to say this, but I did want to bring our attention to it, that these letters were carefully written out. This was not a text message like we might send today. This was not just a spur-of-the-moment thought that comes into my mind, that I write it down immediately and then post it or then send it. This was much more carefully thought out. In the case of Paul, for example, Paul was a Jew. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, as he says. So he, at a young age then, would have memorized huge portions of the Old Testament. And so in Paul's mind then, when he's writing to address a situation, he's writing this overflow of Scripture applied to that situation. He's got his thoughts carefully put together. And so that's the case for every letter that we find in the New Testament. It's meaningful because they're written by the apostles of Jesus Christ who have their thoughts fully formed on these issues and put together, and they're writing to address these situations, and the letters serve to stand in for their own presence with the audience. And so those are the 3 things that we need to know about letters in the New Testament. Now when it comes to interpreting letters, and really interpreting any passage, we want to answer 3 questions, and these correspond to each step of the interpretive journey. First, we want to answer, what does the passage say? And this will be the step that goes along with reading carefully. We want to read the passage carefully. Second, we want to answer the question, what did it mean to the author's original audience. And that goes along with the author's perspective. We want to first understand the passage from the author's perspective. And then lastly, we want to answer the question, what does it mean for us today? That's where we want to understand the text from our perspective. And so with these three steps, with these three questions we want to answer, I want to just draw our attention to a few specific issues related to interpreting the New Testament letters. So first of all, as we're reading carefully, we'll notice that all letters in the New Testament have three parts. Or most letters at least. I can think of 1 John that we're in right now is missing an introduction like we find in Paul's letters. But each letter then has three parts. There's the introduction. This is where the author gives his name. He addresses the community that he's writing to. In Paul's letters, the introduction often includes a thanksgiving section and a prayer section. Then there's the body of the letter. This is where the author develops their train of thought. They know the situation going on in the church or the person that they're writing to, and then they outline their thoughts on that topic, what they think that person or congregation needs to hear. And then lastly, we get the letter closing. This is where the author says farewell and goodbye, and he gives some closing remarks there at the end, often saying, and remember to greet this person and this church and that church. So those are the three parts of the letter that we find. And I draw our attention to this because it's important that when we're reading the body of the letter, when we're reading anything in the middle of a letter, we want to know what the author's been saying before and what he'll say after. We want to understand his train of thought. So one way that we can do that might be helpful is actually to read the whole letter in one sitting. Now that sounds foreign to us maybe when we think about the New Testament letters, but it's true if we received a letter from one of our friends today. We wouldn't flip over to the back of the letter and start reading there. We would want to read at the beginning and read all the way through to the end. So that's a really helpful way for us to understand New Testament letters, is to read them all the way through. Second, when we're answering the question, what did it mean to them, when we're understanding the passage from the author's perspective, I want to just identify a few of the common problems. We mentioned that letters are situational. We see as we read through the New Testament that there were certain themes that just kept popping up in different churches and different communities. So I want to just draw our attention to those themes so that we can be ready when we see them in a passage that we're reading. So the first theme that pops up in a lot of different New Testament letters is the relationship between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. This was a big deal in the early church, that for all of biblical history, God's chosen people had been the Israelites or the Jews. Well, now that Christ has come, now that the church has been formed, what about pagans and Gentiles who want to convert to Christianity? Don't they first need to follow the Old Testament law? Don't they first need to become Jews before they can become Christians? And of course, you can read Acts chapter 15 to learn what the church says about that, but they ultimately say no, not at all, because Christ is God's way of salvation for all people. But this issue, this relationship between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, this was a big deal in the early church, something that the New Testament writers of these letters were constantly referring to. Second is false teachers and false doctrines. You'll find that in almost every letter of the New Testament, that they were aware of heresy going around in these churches, and they were rebuking it. Thirdly, in every letter, we find instruction in Christian doctrine. We find the authors explaining these sometimes difficult concepts of our faith. We find them explaining Christian doctrine. And then lastly, the importance of Christian living. So those are four things that surface in a lot of the letters that are in the New Testament. And so that'll help us then when we think about what it meant to the original audience. I want us to know these common themes that seem to be coming up in several letters. And then finally, when we get to the last step of the interpretive journey, what does it mean for us today? We should be encouraged. In many cases, it's very easy to answer this question if we've already done the first two steps. If we've read carefully and answered what did it mean for them, it's a lot easier to answer the question, what does it mean for us? And this is particularly true in letters, again, because letters are the genre of Scripture that's probably closest to something that we would pick up and read today. So in many cases, then the step from the world of the author to our world today is not a very big step in a lot of cases, and we'll see that as we dive into the text today. For the reflection and application section this week, I want you to study Romans 12, 1 and 2. Now I've got a picture here for you to show you what my page looks like after I've completed step 1. After I've read the text carefully, here's an example of what it might look like to make observations on a text like this. You'll notice there are some important connecting words like therefore. I've also got mercies there underlined because if you read the context of these verses, the literary context as we mentioned, and all that means is the verses before and the verses after. If you read those surrounding verses, you'll see that mercy is a theme in this section. So this is an example then for you to refer to. Now maybe yours looks totally different from this, and that's absolutely fine. The important part here is to read carefully, to spend time reading the text and enjoying the Bible and reading the Bible. So do that. Then move on to step 2. And again, the goal of step 2 is to answer the question, what did it mean for them? So if you've got a study Bible, that's going to be a huge help here. And chances are you'll come across something like I did that mentions that for the church in Rome, there was a long history of tension between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, which again is a theme that we just mentioned, and that's an important element of understanding the book of Romans. So we could ask then, does this passage, does Romans 12, 1 and 2, could it have been that Paul had in mind the relationship between Jewish and Gentile Christians when he was writing these verses? So that could be something that you consider. So go to your study Bible, learn why the letter of Romans was written, learn more about the author and the situation of the church there, and then see how that helps you answer the question, what did Romans 12, 1 and 2 mean for the original audience? And then lastly, we're answering the question, what does it mean for us today? So that's where you take your answer from step 2 and you summarize it for today's audience. And so then once you've got your answer, the main point of the text for today's audience, then you can get really specific answering the question, what does it mean for us today or for my life today? So one application that I walked away with from this passage, it's related to this idea of mercy, that God has shown all of us great mercy in bringing us to salvation, and that now we should live as totally surrendered living sacrifices to God. So one really specific application for me, and again, I came to this application through the process of answering these questions. So it wasn't that I read this passage and then jumped immediately to application for my life. I read the passage, I thought about what did it mean for them, what does it mean for us today. I answered the question then with one sentence, kind of summarizing that, and then here's an application for my life, is that I love to be in control, and specifically, I love to be in control of my relationships with other people, if that makes sense. So I want to be in control. I want to have a control on my schedule and kind of determine what I do and when. And I think from this passage I can see that instead of worrying so much about being in control and managing my schedule, I need to worry about whether or not my life is fully surrendered to God as a sacrifice of worship. So that's one application for me. So spend some time in this text, and then I look forward to Wednesday night when we can all come together as a group and talk about and share our thoughts on this and learn and grow together. So thanks for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next week.